By late afternoon on the 2nd of December, 1805, Russian and Austrian soldiers were trying to get away from the ground south of the Pratzen Heights. The battle had already turned against them, and the retreat was beginning to crowd the narrow roads between the villages. Infantry filled those roads first. Cavalry tried to push through formations that were no longer moving in order, while artillery teams fought to keep their guns moving as French troops closed from behind. The retreat eventually reached the frozen ponds near Satschan. With the roads becoming harder to use, the ice offered another way across. The first men stepped onto it and the surface held, so more followed. Horses and artillery crews came behind them. Soon, large sections of the ponds were carrying troops, still trying to get away from the French advance. Then French artillery opened fire. Shots landed among the retreating columns and across the ice. Men changed direction to get away from the impact points. Horses lost their footing, and heavy guns slowed the groups, trying to move around them. Part of the surface broke. Water pushed up through the fractured ice. The men nearest the opening tried to clear it, but soldiers were still arriving from the rear. A horse went through. A gun carriage tilted as one side dropped lower, and men began throwing away equipment so they could move faster. Another section gave way. Only minutes earlier, the frozen ponds had looked like an available route out. Now soldiers were trying to reach solid ground while French fire continued around them. That morning, the same army had gone into battle expecting to defeat Napoleon. It had more troops than he did, and its commanders believed they had identified the weak point in the French line. Their plan was already being carried out before sunrise. By afternoon, part of that army was standing on ice that was breaking beneath it. How it reached that point begins several months earlier, on the other side of Europe. In the summer of 1805, Napoleon was preparing for a different war. For nearly 2 years, a large French army had been concentrated along the northern coast of France, with major camps around Boulogne. The soldiers were training for an operation Napoleon had discussed repeatedly, a crossing of the English Channel followed by an invasion of Britain. The obstacle was the Royal Navy. Napoleon could assemble a large army and landing craft on the coast, but that did not solve the problem of crossing the Channel, while British naval power controlled access to it. Britain faced a different limitation. Its navy could disrupt French plans at sea, but Napoleon's armies remained powerful across much of continental Europe. British strategy therefore depended heavily on other European states, putting armies into the field against France. By 1805, that effort had produced another coalition. Austria prepared for war. Russia agreed to send forces west, and Britain provided money to support the alliance. Timing was central to the plan. If Austria moved into southern Germany while Russian forces advanced from the east, France would have to react before its continental position became more difficult. Austria moved first. During August and September, Austrian troops advanced into Bavaria under General Karl Mack. Mack expected Russian reinforcements to arrive and strengthen his position before Napoleon could bring enough troops against him. Napoleon received the news while much of his army was still organized around the Channel coast. The planned invasion of Britain was set aside. Orders moved through the French camps, and formations that had spent months preparing for a westward crossing were redirected inland. March routes were changed as the corps left the coast and headed toward the Rhine. For an army of that size, the distance was substantial. The campaign now depended on how quickly the French could reach southern Germany. Napoleon was no longer trying to get his army across the Channel. He needed to reach Mack before the Russian army did. General Karl Mack entered Bavaria expecting time to favor Austria. Russian troops were moving west, and once they arrived, he would have a much larger force available for the campaign. His immediate task was to hold long enough for that concentration to take place. Napoleon reached southern Germany before the Russians could join him. The French did not simply advance on Ulm along the route Mack expected. Separate corps moved along different roads and began appearing around the Austrian position. As they did, The routes Mack would need for a withdrawal came under increasing threat. At first, that danger was difficult to measure. The appearance of one French corps on one road did not mean the Austrian army was trapped. Mack still commanded tens of thousands of men, and the Russian reinforcements were drawing closer. The picture worsened as more French formations arrived. Roads that had seemed open became threatened or controlled, while the Russians were still too far away to solve Mack's immediate problem. Napoleon did not need a large set-piece battle to remove the Austrian army from the campaign. He needed to keep Mack from leaving before the French concentration around Ulm was complete. By October, Mack's choices had narrowed sharply. A successful withdrawal was no longer realistic, and on the 20th of October, he surrendered at Ulm with a large part of his army. The coalition had expected the Austrian advance to hold Napoleon while Russia moved west. Instead, one of Austria's main forces was gone before the Russian army could reach it. Napoleon continued toward Vienna, which French troops entered in November. The campaign, however, was not over. Russian forces were still in the field, and surviving Austrian units joined them. The combined army now gave the coalition the battle it had wanted, though not under the conditions originally planned. Napoleon was deep inside enemy territory after a long march from the Channel coast, and the Allied army gathering ahead was larger than the force he could immediately concentrate around Austerlitz. He could have tried to gain more time. Instead, he began preparing for battle, and one part of that preparation mattered before the first major attack was launched. He wanted to influence where the Allies would commit their strength. The ground around Austerlitz gave both armies an obvious central reference point. Near the middle of the battlefield stood the Pratzen Heights, an elevated position overlooking much of the surrounding area. Troops holding it could watch movement across important parts of the field and shift toward either side when support was needed. Napoleon allowed the Allies to occupy the heights, then made his right flank look vulnerable. As the armies moved closer, French troops withdrew from several forward positions. Napoleon avoided presenting the kind of defensive posture that might make the Allied commanders more cautious, and negotiations were allowed to continue. From the Allied side, those signs supported the impression that the French army would rather avoid a decisive engagement. That impression mattered because the Allied commanders had reasons to believe Napoleon was under pressure. His army had been campaigning rapidly for weeks. Some French formations were still moving toward the battlefield, and the right side of his line appeared weaker than the rest. Their plan developed around that apparent weakness. A strong move south from the Pratzen Heights could strike the French right and continue beyond it. From there, the Allies hoped to threaten Napoleon's communications and obstruct the route he might use if he had to withdraw. There was a cost built into that plan. Troops sent south would no longer be holding the center. Napoleon understood exactly that requirement. He had given up ground. Another commander might have tried to defend, because he wanted the Allied command to feel secure enough on the Pratzen Heights to move substantial forces away from them. The risk was real. The Allies still controlled the heights. If they left a strong force in the center while sending only limited strength south, the opening Napoleon wanted might never become large enough. He could shape the situation, but he could not issue the Allied orders. On the 1st of December, Russian and Austrian commanders met to settle their plan for the next morning. Their attention remained on the French right, and the main Allied attack was assigned to the south. That decision meant thousands of troops around the Pratzen Heights would descend from the plateau and join the movement. Once committed, they would be slower to return if the center came under pressure. By the end of the council, the order had been given. The Allied army would attack at dawn. Napoleon now knew where a large part of it intended to go. Before sunrise on the 2nd of December, the Allied army began to move. Its main attack was directed against Napoleon's right. Russian and Austrian columns descended from the Pratzen Heights and headed south toward the French positions. For a time, the operation appeared to be developing as planned. The French right still looked weak, and Allied commanders believed their troops were moving into position to threaten Napoleon's retreat. More units left the heights to support the attack. Napoleon watched from the French center and did not move at once. The Allied columns needed time to get far enough south. If the French struck before that movement had developed, troops leaving the heights might still be able to turn back before the center was seriously exposed. So the French waited while the Allied march continued. The separation grew between the troops moving south and the formations left around the center. Officers on the Pratzen Heights could still send orders, but thousands of men were already on the roads and fields below the plateau. Napoleon now had the opening he wanted. Marshal Nicolas Soult commanded the French troops facing the heights. His formations had remained close enough to reach the plateau before the Allied command could fully reverse its morning movement. Shortly after sunrise, Soult received the order to advance. French infantry began climbing toward the Pratzen Heights. The Allied officers who remained in the center soon understood what was happening. Napoleon was not preparing to retreat. His main attack was moving toward the position they had just weakened. Messages went south ordering troops to return, but those orders could not erase the distance already created. Some Allied formations were already fighting against the French right. Others were still marching toward it. Turning them around meant stopping columns and sending them back through routes already busy with troops and equipment. The French did not face the same delay. As Soult's leading formations approached the heights, the Allied defenders who were still there prepared to meet them. The fight for the center had begun. Soult's first troops reached the slopes under Allied fire. Russian and Austrian battalions still held parts of the plateau, and the defenders had enough strength to slow the initial French advance. Infantry climbing toward the crest came under musket and artillery fire before it could secure the upper ground. The attack lost momentum, but Soult kept feeding troops into the fight. As French units reached the heights, the fighting spread across the plateau. Allied battalions ordered back from the south began to arrive, though not together and not in the formation they had held before the morning attack. Some reached the center while other units were still miles away. That delay gave the French a practical advantage. Their reinforcements were already close to the point of attack, while the Allies had to recover troops committed to another part of the battlefield and bring them back under pressure. Positions changed hands during the fighting. French units gained ground and then gave some of it back. Allied officers tried to rebuild a continuous line as returning battalions arrived at different times. The importance of the heights was now clear. If the French took the center, the Allied force south of the plateau would be increasingly separated from the formations farther north. Napoleon committed more strength to the center. The Allied defense gradually gave ground. More French infantry reached the upper plateau, and gaps opened between formations that had returned separately. By late morning, French troops controlled the central heights. That changed the structure of the battle. A large Allied force remained south of the Pratzen Heights, still engaged around Napoleon's right, while other Allied formations stood farther north. French troops now occupied the ground between them. Orders could still travel, but the two sections could no longer support each other, as they had before the center was lost. Napoleon had taken back the position he had deliberately left open before the battle. He then ordered the French advance to continue beyond the plateau. For the Allied soldiers in the south, the danger was only beginning to become clear. They had gone forward, expecting to move around Napoleon's flank. French troops were now coming down from the heights behind them. Their next problem was no longer how to press the attack. It was how to get out, south of the Pratzen Heights. Allied troops were still fighting under orders issued before dawn. Their objective had been Napoleon's right flank, where Marshal Louis-Nicolas Devout's men had been under heavy pressure for hours. The Allied columns expected continued attacks to force the French position back and open a route behind Napoleon's army. Then reports from the north began to reach them. The Pratzen Heights had been lost, and French troops were moving down the southern side of the plateau. That created a problem the Allied plan had not allowed for. Devout's troops were still in front of them, while Soult's formations were approaching from behind and from higher ground. Orders went out to withdraw. The difficulty appeared almost immediately. The roads behind the attacking columns were already carrying artillery, ammunition wagons and troops that had moved forward earlier in the morning. When battalions began trying to reverse direction through the same area, the retreat slowed. French pressure continued to build. Artillery moved onto the captured heights, giving the French a better position from which to fire into the crowded ground below. Soult's infantry pushed south, while Devout's men remained in contact with the Allied formations from the other side. The morning attack began to lose its organization. Officers tried to pull units toward safer routes, but news of the changing situation reached formations at different times. One battalion could begin withdrawing while another nearby continued fighting under an earlier order. By early afternoon, the southern wing was no longer trying to break the French right. Its immediate problem was to leave the area before the French advance closed more of the available routes. Thousands of soldiers were now moving through a restricted space south of the heights. Infantry, horses and artillery teams crowded the same roads as more units tried to withdraw. French troops remained close enough to make an orderly halt difficult. The retreat moved toward the villages and ponds around Satschan. Ahead lay a broad stretch of frozen water under normal conditions. Few commanders would have chosen that surface for a crowded military withdrawal. But the roads were becoming harder to use, and men began moving toward the ice. The first soldiers to step onto the frozen ponds found that the surface held. That was enough for the men behind them to keep coming. The troops reaching the water were already under pressure. French infantry was advancing from the direction of the Pratzen Heights, while artillery fire continued to fall around the withdrawing formations. The normal roads offered little relief. Wagons were caught between infantry units. Horses struggled to turn artillery pieces through the congestion, and soldiers moving south found their way blocked by men arriving from other parts of the field. The ice, by comparison, looked open. Several groups crossed without difficulty, encouraging others to follow. Within minutes, the load was much heavier as infantry. Mounted soldiers and artillery crews crowded onto the same surface. Movement slowed near the middle of the ponds. French guns began firing toward the retreating troops. A cannonball struck close to one column, sending men away from the impact point. Another shot landed farther ahead. Horses pulled sideways as their teams tried to avoid the areas under fire. Near one heavily loaded section, the ice began to fracture. At first, the opening was small. A horse broke through with one leg, and the men around it moved away, forcing those behind them to change direction. Then the crack widened. A gun carriage pressed onto the weakened surface, and one wheel dropped through. The carriage tilted, pulled the horses back, and the ice failed under the weight. Men jumped aside as the gun went into the water. The opening spread. Soldiers already beyond the damaged section continued toward the far bank. Those coming from behind met men turning back and tried to move around them. The available space narrowed quickly, taking several soldiers into the water. Packs and weapons made it harder for them to climb back onto the ice. Men close enough to help pulled at arms and equipment, only to find the edge breaking under the added weight. French fire continued around the ponds. Farther away, another artillery team tried to cross. Its horses made it several yards before the surface under the front of the team fractured. The movement stopped, and the soldiers behind the vehicle had to turn aside. By then, the retreat no longer followed a single route across the ice. Men were spreading toward any section that still appeared usable. Formation disappeared. Soldiers dropped muskets because they needed their hands free to balance or pull themselves forward. Wounded men who had been supported by comrades became much harder to carry across the damaged surface. Riderless horses moved among groups of infantry and forced men toward sections they had been trying to avoid. Another shell struck the ice, and water rose through a fresh opening. A soldier near the edge disappeared when the surface gave way under him. Men close by tried to pull him out, but the ice continued breaking around their knees. More troops were still reaching the ponds from the battlefield behind them. They could see damaged ice ahead, but stopping left them closer to the French advance, so many continued onto the surface. The load increased again. Cracks that had started in separate places began to meet. Pieces of ice shifted under men and animals. A wagon settled low enough for water to come over its sides before it slipped below the surface. The frozen route no longer offered a clear line across. Soldiers moved toward whatever still seemed solid. Some reached the opposite bank. Others turned back when open water blocked the way. The retreat had begun with battalions moving under orders. On the ponds, those formations could no longer operate. Individual soldiers were trying to find any surface that would support them. The disaster on the ice did not decide the Battle of Austerlitz. The decisive change had already come when the Allied center was weakened, and the Pratzen Heights were lost. What happened on the ponds showed what that defeat meant for the men caught in the retreat. They had begun the morning as part of an army that expected to surround Napoleon. By afternoon, many were trying to get away across ice that was failing under their feet. By late afternoon, the Allied army could no longer restore a continuous front. Some formations escaped south and east. Others were cut off during the withdrawal and surrendered. Units that had begun the morning under one battle plan were now leaving by different routes with limited contact between them. French troops controlled the Pratzen Heights and much of the ground around Austerlitz. As darkness approached, the fighting gradually came to an end. Napoleon had entered the battle with a smaller army, facing the combined forces of Russia and Austria. By the end of the day, the coalition had suffered a defeat that altered the campaign immediately. Emperor Francis of Austria soon opened negotiations with Napoleon. The Treaty of Pressburg followed later that month, requiring Austria to give up territory and accept new political conditions imposed by France. The Third Coalition, created to challenge Napoleon's power in Europe, effectively collapsed. The Russian army withdrew from Central Europe. Britain remained at war with France, but its continental partners had been defeated before the end of 1805. For Napoleon, Austerlitz became the most important victory of his career up to that point. The result had not depended on a simple frontal assault. The critical change came when the Allied command moved a large part of its army away from the Pratzen Heights. Once the French took the weakened center, the Allied plan could no longer work as intended. The fighting around the frozen ponds came after that point. By the time men were trying to cross the ice, the battle had already been lost. At the start of the 2nd of December, the Allied army held the Pratzen Heights. Its commanders moved a large part of their force away from that position, because they believed Napoleon's right offered the best chance to defeat him. That decision created the opening the French had been waiting for. Soult's attack took the heights and split the Allied army. The formations fighting farther south then learned that French troops were moving behind them, and the offensive they had begun before dawn turned into a withdrawal. That withdrawal eventually reached the frozen ponds near Satschan. The ice did not cause the Allied defeat at Austerlitz. The battle had already turned through decisions made earlier in the day, especially the decision to weaken the center while the main attack moved south. For the soldiers who stepped onto the ponds, however, those earlier decisions had become an immediate problem. They were trying to leave a battlefield whose routes were closing while French pressure continued behind them. In the morning, they had moved toward what their commanders believed was Napoleon's vulnerable flank. Hours later, many were moving away from the same area with the French in pursuit. Napoleon's decisive success came on the Pratzen Heights. For some of the men caught in the southern retreat, the last usable ground in front of them was the ice. Austerlitz gave Napoleon more than control of the battlefield. Austria had lost another major campaign and could no longer continue the war on the same terms. Emperor Francis accepted peace, and Russian forces withdrew from the region. For the moment, France faced no comparable army in Central Europe. The political consequences continued into the following year. Napoleon reorganized territories across Germany and increased French influence over states that had belonged to the Holy Roman Empire. In 1806, Emperor Francis gave up the imperial title, bringing an institution that had existed for centuries to an end. Austerlitz did not by itself cause every political change that followed. It did, however, give Napoleon the military position from which he could impose a new settlement across much of Central Europe. His position was now far stronger than it had been only a few years earlier. The army that had spent the summer of 1805 preparing to invade Britain had crossed the continent instead, forcing Mack's surrender at Ulm before entering Vienna, and later defeating the combined Russian and Austrian army near Austerlitz. Britain remained beyond Napoleon's control. Its navy had defeated the Franco-Spanish fleet at Trafalgar only weeks before Austerlitz, making a French invasion of Britain increasingly unrealistic. The war between Britain and France therefore continued after Austria left the coalition. Napoleon would face new enemies in the years that followed. Even so, Austerlitz became closely associated with his ability to influence an opponent's decisions before committing his main attack. The Allied command went into the battle believing the French right was vulnerable. Its attempt to exploit that weakness reduced the strength left on the Pratzen Heights and gave Napoleon the opening he needed. Once the center was lost, the southern Allied formations were in danger of being cut off. Their withdrawal led them toward the frozen ponds that appeared at the beginning of this story. By then, Napoleon did not need another complicated maneuver. The Allied plan had already failed. The soldiers still trying to leave the field were dealing with what that failure had produced.